This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. At just 16 years old, Hailey Monroe was the type of teenager who made adults nod approvingly and peers roll their eyes in annoyance. She was a straight-A student, a diligent employee at Willow Creek Department Store, and the pride of her single mother, who often boasted about Hailey's accomplishments to anyone who would listen. To the outside world, Hailey was a model of ambition and discipline, an example of what hard work could achieve. Beneath this polished exterior, however, was a girl teetering on the edge of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Hailey's part-time job at Willow Creek was meant to be a stepping stone, a way to save money for college and gain some real-world experience. The department store, with its bright lights and endless aisles of neatly arranged merchandise, seemed like the perfect place for a responsible teenager to prove herself. From the moment she started working there, Hailey threw herself into her role with relentless determination. She volunteered for extra shifts, stayed late to help clean up, and took on tasks that others avoided, like folding mountains of rejected clothes in the fitting rooms or restocking heavy boxes in the storage area. Her managers praised her work ethic, occasionally rewarding her with small tokens of appreciation, a gift card here, a commendation there. But while Hailey earned the admiration of her supervisors, her relationship with her coworkers was far more complicated. Most of them were older college students looking for easy paychecks or adults who treated the job as a necessary evil rather than a career. They saw Hailey's eagerness not as admirable but as grating. Her constant willingness to pick up shifts or go the extra mile made them look bad in comparison, and they resented her for it. Hailey, in turn, felt their disdain but didn't know how to address it. She wasn't good at socializing, and her attempts to fit in often came across as awkward or overeager. Hailey's isolation only deepened over time. Her coworkers began excluding her from conversations, dismissing her contributions during group tasks, and mocking her behind her back. Hailey often caught snippets of their whispered jokes, their laughter cutting like knives. The smallest mistakes she made, spilling coffee, forgetting to clock out on time, were blown out of proportion, becoming fuel for their ridicule. They gave her nicknames like teacher's pet and try-hard words that burrowed under her skin and stayed there. At first, Hailey tried to ignore it. She convinced herself that their teasing didn't matter, that she was better off focusing on her goals. But the more she tried to brush it off, the more it seemed to escalate. Little pranks, like misplacing her belongings or leaving her to close up the store alone, became routine. Once they even swapped her name badge with one that read Mop Girl, a cruel jab at her tendency to take on menial tasks. Hailey laughed it off publicly, but later that night, she lay awake, clutching the fake badge in her trembling hands and wondering why she was always the target. Her home life offered little solace. Hailey's mother, though loving, was often preoccupied with her demanding job as a nurse. She worked long hours, leaving Hailey to fend for herself most evenings. When they did talk, their conversations revolved around Hailey's achievements, her grades, her plans for college, her progress at work. There was little room for Hailey to voice her frustrations or fears, and even if there had been, she wouldn't have known how to express them. To her mother, Hailey was the perfect daughter, and Hailey didn't want to shatter that illusion. Instead, she turned inward, retreating into her thoughts and fantasies. At school, she kept her head down, avoiding the gossiping cliques and chaotic lunchrooms. At work, she maintained a facade of professionalism, even as her coworkers' jabs grew sharper. She began to notice patterns in their behavior, cataloging their routines and weaknesses like a researcher studying a hostile species. She knew who always left early, who shirked their duties, and who covered for whom. These observations started as a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of the dynamics that left her feeling so powerless. Over time, however, they took on a different tone, one of calculation. In her free time, Hailey started journaling, not about her feelings but about her coworkers. She filled pages with their quirks and habits, their strengths and vulnerabilities. What began as harmless venting evolved into something darker. She imagined scenarios where she wasn't the one being laughed at, where she held the power and they were forced to respect or fear her. These thoughts frightened her at first, but the more she indulged them, the more they felt like a release. Hailey's co-workers had no idea of the storm brewing behind her calm exterior. To them, she was just the quiet girl who worked too hard and tried too much. They didn't see the way her hands trembled when she picked up their discarded trash, or the way her jaw tightened when they rolled their eyes at her suggestions. They didn't notice the way she watched them, her eyes lingering a little too long as they joked or slacked off. To them, she was invisible, an afterthought in their mundane routines. But Hailey saw everything, and in the shadows of her mind, she was already beginning to plan. The breaking point for Hailey Monroe came on a cold Friday evening in December, during what should have been an ordinary company meeting at Willow Creek Department Store. The store manager, Mr. Randall, had called everyone together to discuss the holiday season's sales goals and announce the candidates for a long-awaited promotion. The position of shift supervisor had been open for weeks, and Hailey had been working tirelessly to prove herself worthy of the role. She had volunteered for extra shifts, taken on the most grueling tasks without complaint, and even stayed late to help organize inventory during the chaotic Black Friday rush. To Hailey, this promotion wasn't just a step up the career ladder, it was validation, a chance to be recognized as more than just the awkward teenager everyone dismissed. It was her opportunity to silence the mocking voices of her coworkers and earn the respect she had always craved. She had allowed herself to dream about hearing her name called in front of everyone, about seeing the looks on their faces when they realized she wasn't someone to be underestimated. The meeting began like any other, with Mr. Randall droning on about quarterly profits and upcoming sales events. Hailey sat near the front, notebook in hand, her posture rigid with anticipation. Her co-workers lounged in their chairs behind her, whispering and snickering as usual. She tried to tune them out, focusing on the moment she had been working toward. Finally, Mr. Randall reached the part of the agenda everyone had been waiting for, the announcement of the new shift supervisor. He began by listing the qualities he was looking for: dedication, reliability, a strong work ethic. Hailey felt her heart race as he spoke. She met all of those criteria and more. Her eyes darted to the clipboard in his hands, as if willing her name to appear there. Then, with a smile, Mr. Randall announced the winner, Lindsay Carter. Hailey froze. Lindsay? The name echoed in her mind, almost mocking her. Lindsay was one of the least deserving candidates, a 20-year-old college dropout who treated the job as a joke. She was known for shirking her duties, spending her shifts scrolling through her phone or gossiping with coworkers in the break room. Hailey's chest tightened as she forced a smile, clapping along with the others as Lindsay strutted to the front to accept the congratulatory handshake. The betrayal didn't end there. After the meeting, as the employees trickled out of the stockroom, Hailey overheard the reason behind Lindsay's promotion. "It's not like she earned it," one of her coworkers whispered with a laugh. "She's just been flirting with Randall for weeks." Everyone knows that the words hit Hailey like a slap. All her hard work, all her sacrifices had been for nothing. Lindsay hadn't earned the promotion through merit, she had manipulated her way into it. Hailey's world tilted. The humiliation burned hot in her chest as her coworkers laughed and joked about the announcement. Someone nudged her on the way out, muttering, "Better luck next time. Try hard," before disappearing into the store. For a moment, Hailey stood alone in the stockroom, staring at the floor as a storm of emotions raged inside her. Later that night, as Hailey methodically folded clothes in the women's department, the weight of her disappointment and anger grew unbearable. Lindsay passed by with a smug smile, surrounded by a group of coworkers who were fawning over her. "Guess I'm your boss now, huh?" Lindsay quipped, loud enough for Hailey to hear. The others burst into laughter, and Hailey felt something inside her snap. It wasn't just the promotion. It was everything: the years of being overlooked, underestimated, and ridiculed. It was the way her coworkers dismissed her as unimportant, the way they exploited her diligence while laughing behind her back. It was the endless cycle of giving her best and receiving nothing in return. The promotion had been her one hope, the light at the end of a dark tunnel, and now that light was gone. The incident solidified something in Hailey's mind. She realized she would never earn their respect, no matter how hard she worked or how much she sacrificed. They would always see her as the awkward, invisible girl who tried too hard. She was done playing by their rules, done hoping for their validation. For the first time, she allowed herself to embrace the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. That night, Hailey sat in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face, pale and expressionless, felt like a mask. She thought about everything she had endured, the pranks, the insults, the constant exclusion, and felt the first stirrings of a dark resolve. In the back of her mind, an idea began to take shape. It was small and fragile at first, like a seed waiting to be nurtured, but as the hours passed, it grew, fed by her anger and the burning need to reclaim her sense of power. By the time the sun rose, Hailey had made up her mind. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them laugh at her anymore. If respect wasn't something they were willing to give, she would take it by force. In that moment, Hailey's fate and the fate of everyone who worked with her was sealed. After the crushing betrayal at work, Hailey Monroe's focus shifted from earning recognition to meticulously planning her revenge. Her nights were no longer spent revising school notes or organizing her schedule for the week ahead. Instead, she poured her energy into constructing a plan that would make her coworkers pay for every insult, every slight, and every humiliation they had inflicted upon her. What started as fleeting thoughts of retaliation soon crystallized into a calculated, coldly methodical blueprint for vengeance. Hailey's part-time job at Willow Creek Department Store had given her an intimate understanding of the building's layout and its vulnerabilities. The sprawling store was divided into departments: women's wear, electronics, home goods, and each area had its quirks. She knew which shelves created blind spots, which emergency exits were seldom used, and which parts of the store's security system were outdated or unreliable. These observations, once dismissed as trivial, now became the foundation of her plan. The first step was determining when to strike. Hailey decided on a late-night closing shift, knowing it would minimize the risk of customers being present while ensuring that her coworkers, the true targets of her rage, would be confined within the store. The staff for these shifts was usually smaller, which would make it easier for her to control the situation. As an added bonus, the late hour meant fewer supervisors and managers on duty, leaving her with a workforce of peers she despised. Hailey began gathering supplies. The items she chose were unassuming, easy to acquire, and unlikely to raise suspicion. A hunting knife purchased online, a small handgun stolen from her mother's locked safe, and a length of rope she found in the garage were the first tools added to her growing arsenal. She also began collecting common household items to create makeshift weapons, researching tutorials online under the guise of studying science experiments for school. She kept everything hidden in her closet, buried under piles of old clothes and boxes, where no one would think to look. Disabling the store's security system was her next priority. Hailey knew the cameras covering the sales floor were outdated and prone to malfunctions, a fact she had overheard her coworkers complaining about during shifts. The storage area, however, was equipped with newer cameras that would need to be disabled. Over the course of several weeks, Hailey tested ways to disrupt the system, subtly tampering with power outlets and using her phone's flashlight to blind the cameras during shifts. Her coworkers dismissed these incidents as technical glitches, giving her the confidence to execute her plan on a larger scale. To ensure the success of her attack, Hailey studied her coworkers' habits with even greater intensity than before. She learned who liked to take long breaks in the break room, who avoided the storage area, and who often stayed late to gossip instead of working. She noted where they liked to gather during lulls in the evening and which sections of the store they avoided altogether. These patterns became critical to her plan, allowing her to predict their movements and ensure she could catch them off guard. Hailey also began subtly manipulating her coworkers to create the conditions she needed. She volunteered for additional closing shifts, knowing it would put her in a position to influence the roster. She offered to switch shifts with colleagues, ensuring that the employees she resented most would be present on the chosen night. Her willingness to accommodate others went unnoticed, as most of her coworkers were too busy taking advantage of her generosity to question her motives. As the night of the attack approached, Hailey refined every detail of her plan. She mapped out escape routes within the store, not for her own use but to block them off and prevent her coworkers from fleeing. She practiced assembling and using her weapons in the privacy of her room, her hands steady as she imagined the chaos she would soon unleash. She even rehearsed her movements, pacing through the store in her mind, visualizing where she would strike first and how she would maintain control of the situation. The final piece of the puzzle was ensuring that the store would be locked down when the time came. Hailey knew the routine for closing shifts. One employee was always assigned to lock the front doors while others finished their tasks. She planned to volunteer for this responsibility, giving her the opportunity to secure the store and ensure no one could enter or escape. Once the doors were locked, she would cut the power, plunging the building into darkness and sowing panic among her coworkers. As the chosen night drew closer, Hailey's demeanor at work changed subtly. She remained quiet and diligent, but there was a newfound calmness in her behavior, a sense of purpose that even she didn't fully understand. Her coworkers, as usual, paid her little attention. They didn't notice the slight tension in her shoulders or the way her eyes lingered on certain parts of the store. To them, she was still just the overly eager teenager they loved to mock. By the time the night arrived, Hailey was ready. Her weapons were concealed in her backpack, her plan committed to memory, and her resolve unshakable. As she walked into the store for her closing shift, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and detachment. She knew there would be no turning back, but she also felt an odd sense of liberation. For the first time, she wasn't trying to please anyone or fit into a mold that wasn't made for her. She was taking control, even if it meant losing everything in the process. Hailey clocked in, exchanged a few brief words with her coworkers, and got to work as if it were any other shift. But in her mind, the countdown had already begun. The hours ticked by, each minute bringing her closer to the moment when the doors would lock, the lights would go out, and the store would become her carefully constructed trap. The massacre began quietly, almost imperceptibly, during the late-night closing shift at Willow Creek Department Store. It was a typical Tuesday evening, and the store was eerily empty, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly against the silence. Hailey Monroe had spent weeks ensuring that this night would unfold exactly as she planned. The preparations had been meticulous, every detail accounted for, every variable considered. The shift started uneventfully. The staff, 11 employees, including Hailey, were scattered across the vast store, tidying shelves, folding clothes, and cleaning displays. The routine monotony of the work lulled her coworkers into a false sense of security, their minds already on the end of their shift and the relief of heading home. None of them noticed the faint tension in the air, or the way Hailey moved through the store with a purpose that seemed slightly off. Hailey's first act was to ensure they couldn't leave. Earlier in the day, she had discreetly sabotaged the locking mechanisms on the front and emergency exit doors. She had studied the store's security systems for weeks, learning which cameras could be disabled without raising suspicion and which blind spots she could exploit. By the time the shift began, the exits were sealed, and the cameras were already looping old footage. The store had become a trap, and only Hailey knew the way out. Her plan relied on isolation. The employees worked in different departments, separated by walls of merchandise and the cavernous layout of the store. This division allowed her to target them one by one, minimizing the chance of resistance. She started in the break room, where an older employee, Susan, was sitting alone, scrolling through her phone during her break. Hailey approached silently, her movements deliberate and calm. The first strike was swift, efficient, a knife she had concealed in her apron plunging into Susan's side before she could react. The noise was minimal, just a gasp and the scrape of a chair as Susan collapsed. Hailey dragged the body into the storage closet, wiping the blood from her hands onto a rag she had brought for this purpose. She paused for a moment, her chest rising and falling as adrenaline coursed through her veins. It wasn't fear or guilt she felt, it was a chilling sense of control. For the first time, she was the one dictating the terms, and it emboldened her to continue. The next victim was Ryan, a college student working in electronics. He was unpacking boxes of headphones when Hailey found him. She used the element of surprise again, this time wielding a hammer she had taken from the maintenance room. The blunt force of the blow sent Ryan crumpling to the ground, the sound of the impact muffled by the store's thick carpet. By the time the third and fourth victims fell, the others began to notice something was wrong. Lindsay, the newly promoted shift supervisor, was the first to raise the alarm. She called out to the others, her voice echoing through the empty aisles. But Hailey had anticipated this. She had turned off the store's intercom system and disabled their phones by cutting the landline connection and jamming the Wi-Fi router. Panic set in as Lindsay and the remaining employees realized they were trapped. The store descended into chaos. Some tried to hide, squeezing into dressing rooms or crouching behind counters, while others made desperate attempts to break through the locked exits. Hailey moved through the aisles like a predator, her familiarity with the store giving her a distinct advantage. She knew every hiding spot, every shortcut, every weakness. Her makeshift arsenal, knives, hammers, even tools from the store's hardware section ensured that each encounter ended swiftly and brutally. The fluorescent lights, which had always seemed so sterile and unremarkable, now cast an unsettling glow over the blood-streaked floors. The cheerful displays of holiday decorations and neatly arranged merchandise became a macabre backdrop to the carnage. The once familiar sound of barcode scanning and cash registers dinging was replaced by muffled cries and the thud of footsteps running through the aisles. Lindsay, realizing the severity of the situation, attempted to rally the remaining employees. She armed herself with a fire extinguisher, trying to protect herself and the others. But Hailey was relentless. When Lindsay confronted her near the cosmetics section, the ensuing struggle was short-lived. Hailey's determination and cold efficiency overpowered Lindsay's desperation, leaving the once smug supervisor lifeless on the floor. One by one, the employees fell. Each death was marked by a calculated precision that left no room for error. Hailey wasn't driven by rage or passion, her actions were methodical, almost detached. The screams and pleading didn't faze her, they were simply background noise to the execution of her plan. By the time the police arrived, responding to a silent alarm that had been triggered by a customer earlier in the day, the store was eerily quiet again. Hailey stood in the center of the carnage, her clothing stained with blood, her expression blank. Around her, the bodies of her co-workers lay scattered, the store's bright aisles now stained with the evidence of her rampage. The officers entered cautiously, their weapons drawn, but Hailey didn't resist. She raised her hands slowly, the knife she had been holding falling to the floor with a metallic clang. Her eyes met those of the first officer who approached, and for a brief moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. It wasn't regret or fear, it was something colder, something final. The massacre at Willow Creek Department Store was over, but its echoes would linger for years to come. The bloodshed and horror of that night would haunt the survivors, the first responders, and the community that once believed such violence was unimaginable. At the center of it all was Hailey Monroe, the quiet teenager who had turned a mundane workplace into a scene of terror and destruction. The aftermath of the massacre at Willow Creek Department Store was as devastating as the event itself. By the time the police entered the blood-soaked aisles and apprehended Hailey Monroe, the damage had already been done. 11 employees were dead, their bodies scattered across the store like grim reminders of the chaos that had unfolded. The scene was one of unimaginable horror, blood smeared on the polished floors, shattered glass glinting under harsh fluorescent lights, and the eerie stillness of a place that had once been filled with routine sounds of commerce. Hailey surrendered without resistance. She stood in the center of the carnage, her hands raised and her face expressionless, as if she were merely clocking out from an ordinary shift. The officers who cuffed her were visibly shaken, their boots crunching over broken merchandise and the remnants of her rampage. Hailey remained silent as they led her away, her small frame dwarfed by the officers flanking her. There were no tears, no shouts, no signs of remorse, just a blank stare that seemed to pierce through the chaos around her. The news broke within hours, spreading like wildfire across social media and news networks. The story of a teenage girl committing a calculated massacre at her workplace was as shocking as it was incomprehensible. The headlines were stark and unrelenting: teenage killer slaughters 11 in department store massacre bloodbath in suburbia, the Hailey Monroe case, in the face of unthinkable evil. Hailey's mugshot, her pale face and hollow eyes staring directly into the camera, became the image that defined the tragedy. Public reaction was swift and polarized. Across the country, People grappled with the question, how could a 16-year-old girl commit such an atrocity? Theories abounded, each more sensational than the last. Some pointed to her home life, speculating that neglect or abuse had driven her to violence. Others blamed societal factors, bullying, the pressures of adolescence, or the pervasive influence of violent media. Conspiracy theorists latched onto the idea that she had been radicalized online or that she was part of a larger, shadowy network. The survivors and the families of the victims were left to pick up the pieces. The small town where Willow Creek was located became a focal point for grief and outrage. Candlelight vigils were held outside the store, the makeshift memorials growing larger with each passing day. Flowers, notes, and photographs of the victims lined the sidewalks, a poignant reminder of the lives that had been stolen. The community, once tightly knit, now seemed fractured by the weight of its collective trauma. The store itself was shut down indefinitely, its doors boarded up, and its interior left untouched as investigators combed through every inch for evidence. The place that had once been a hub of activity and mundane work now stood as a hollow shell, a grim monument to the horrors that had occurred within its walls. Hailey's arrest became the center of a national conversation about violence, mental health, and the warning signs that are too often missed. Reporters dug into her past, interviewing former classmates, teachers, and neighbors. What emerged was a portrait of a girl who had always been quiet, reserved, and largely unnoticed. Her exceptional grades and work ethic contrasted sharply with the darkness she had concealed. Psychologists weighed in, debating whether Hailey's actions were the result of untreated mental illness, prolonged bullying, or a combination of factors. Some described her as a ticking time bomb who had finally exploded after years of internalizing pain and resentment. Others argued that her methodical planning and lack of remorse suggested a deeper, more chilling pathology. The legal proceedings began with intense public scrutiny. Hailey was charged with 11 counts of first-degree murder, among other charges, and her trial became one of the most closely watched cases in recent memory. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded killer, highlighting the premeditation and precision of her actions. They emphasized the sheer brutality of the massacre, the lives lost, and the suffering of the survivors. Hailey's defense team faced an uphill battle. They argued that she was a victim of systemic failures, including workplace bullying and a lack of mental health resources. They brought in experts to testify about the psychological toll of her isolation and humiliation, attempting to frame her actions as the tragic culmination of years of neglect and mistreatment. However, Hailey's own behavior complicated their case. She refused to speak during the trial, her silence interpreted by many as a lack of remorse. Her blank expressions and refusal to engage with the court made it difficult for even her defenders to humanize her. Public opinion remained divided. Some saw Hailey as a symbol of a broken system, a young girl pushed to the brink by forces beyond her control. Others viewed her as a monster incapable of redemption and deserving of the harshest punishment. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with demonstrators holding signs that read "Justice for the victims and stop failing our youth." The trial became more than just a legal battle, it was a referendum on society's role in preventing such tragedies. When the verdict was finally delivered, Hailey was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the calculated nature of her crimes and the devastating impact on the community. As she was led out of the courtroom, her face remained as unreadable as it had been on the night of the massacre. In the months and years that followed, the massacre at Willow Creek became a cautionary tale. Employers across the country revisited their policies on workplace harassment and mental health support, implementing new measures to identify and address signs of distress among their employees. Schools introduced programs aimed at combating bullying and fostering inclusion, while lawmakers debated stricter gun control and more robust mental health funding. Despite these efforts, the scars left by Hailey Monroe's actions remained. The families of the victims struggled to move forward, their lives permanently altered by the loss of their loved ones. Survivors battled with survivor's guilt, reliving the nightmare in their minds even as they tried to rebuild their lives. And for the town, Willow Creek became a name synonymous with tragedy, a place that would never truly escape the shadow of that bloody night. Hailey herself faded from the public eye, her name invoked less frequently as time passed. Yet her story remained a haunting reminder of the thin line between ordinary and extraordinary violence and the devastating consequences of a world that looks away until it's too late. The massacre at Willow Creek Department Store left a scar on the town of Maple Ridge that would never fully heal. In the weeks and months that followed the tragedy, the once quiet suburban community became a symbol of loss, grief, and the urgent need for change. The event had upended every facet of life in Maple Ridge, forcing its residents, local businesses, and even the broader retail industry to confront harsh truths about the systems that had failed to prevent such a horrific act. For the residents of Maple Ridge, life was divided into before and after before. The town had been a typical slice of Americana, a place where people waved to neighbors, children rode bikes down tree-lined streets, and families gathered at the local diner for Sunday brunch. After the massacre, an uneasy tension settled over the town. People walked more cautiously, avoided eye contact with strangers, and whispered in hushed tones about the lives lost that fateful night. The cheerful sense of security that had once defined the community was gone, replaced by a lingering fear that something so horrific could happen again. The physical site of the massacre became a grim focal point for both mourning and debate. The boarded-up storefront of Willow Creek loomed like a ghost in the middle of Maple Ridge's bustling commercial district. Once a hub of activity, the store now stood as a silent reminder of the violence that had unfolded within its walls. The town's leaders struggled with what to do with the building. Some residents called for it to be demolished, believing that erasing its presence would help the community heal. Others argued for preserving it as a memorial site to honor the victims and serve as a cautionary tale for future generations. Eventually, the store was transformed into a memorial park. The decision was a compromise, an attempt to strike a balance between remembrance and renewal. The park featured a reflective garden, benches inscribed with the names of the victims, and a sculpture symbolizing hope rising from tragedy. On the anniversary of the massacre, candlelight vigils were held there, drawing survivors, victims' families, and supporters from across the region. The park became a place of both sorrow and resilience, a space where people could confront their grief and find a measure of peace. The impact of the massacre extended far beyond Maple Ridge. It sent shockwaves through the retail industry, prompting major chains and small businesses alike to reevaluate their workplace policies. The incident highlighted the vulnerabilities of young workers, particularly teenagers like Hailey Monroe, who often juggled part-time jobs with the pressures of school and adolescence. Employers faced intense scrutiny for failing to recognize warning signs of distress and allowing toxic workplace cultures to fester. In response, companies implemented sweeping changes aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Anti-harassment training became mandatory for employees at all levels, and workplace mental health programs were expanded to include regular check-ins and confidential counseling services. Managers were trained to spot red flags, such as isolation, sudden changes in behavior, or expressions of anger, and encouraged to address these issues proactively. Retail chains also introduced new safety measures to protect both employees and customers. Enhanced surveillance systems, improved emergency response protocols, and stricter hiring practices became the norm. Some stores even began implementing anonymous feedback systems, allowing employees to report bullying or other workplace concerns without fear of retaliation. While these changes were welcomed by many, they also served as a stark reminder of the tragedy that had necessitated them. For schools, the massacre became a call to action. Educators and administrators recognized the urgent need to address bullying, mental health, and the unique challenges faced by teenagers balancing work and academics. Programs designed to foster inclusivity and teach conflict resolution were introduced, while counselors worked to create safe spaces where students could share their struggles without judgment. Hailey Monroe's story became part of the curriculum in some schools, a chilling example used to spark discussions about empathy, resilience, and the importance of seeking help. The families of the victims, meanwhile, channeled their grief into activism. They formed advocacy groups focused on workplace safety, mental health awareness, and gun control, speaking at conferences, lobbying for legislative reforms, and sharing their stories in the hope of preventing future tragedies. Their efforts gained national attention, and though progress was slow, it sparked meaningful conversations about the systemic changes needed to protect vulnerable individuals. Hailey Monroe herself became a polarizing figure in the years following the massacre. Some viewed her as a monster, an irredeemable villain who had shattered countless lives. Others saw her as a tragic symbol of a broken system, a teenager whose cries for help had gone unheard until it was too late. Books, documentaries, and podcasts dissected her life and actions, exploring the factors that had driven her to commit such an unthinkable crime. Her name became a shorthand for debates about youth violence, mental health, and societal responsibility, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. Despite the changes in conversations spurred by the tragedy, the emotional wounds in Maple Ridge remained raw. Survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, haunted by memories of the massacre. The families of the victims faced an unrelenting ache, their loss compounded by the knowledge that it could have been prevented. Even those who had not been directly affected felt the weight of the tragedy, their sense of safety forever altered. As the years passed, Maple Ridge slowly began to heal. New businesses opened, and the town's streets buzzed with life once more. Yet the shadow of the massacre lingered, woven into the fabric of the community. It was a reminder of the fragility of normalcy, of the darkness that could emerge when warning signs were ignored and pain went unacknowledged. The massacre at Willow Creek Department Store became a defining moment for Maple Ridge, shaping its identity and its future. The town carried the weight of its legacy with quiet determination, using its pain to drive change and ensure that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. While the memories of that fateful night could never be erased, they became a part of a larger story, one of resilience, accountability, and the enduring strength of a community determined to move forward.